Here back there. Can this come off? Okay. All right. I never get to hold like this. I feel very free. Well, good morning to all. Thank you to Textile Exchange for inviting me. Blame Marcy Zaroff if things don't go well this morning. We actually went to high school together. It's scary. So I think my job today is to step back, provide a pretty big perspective on the really big trends that are changing business, the driving forces behind companies talking about sustainability and environmental and social issues. And it's a pleasure to be here in a beautiful place and during a time of such peacefulness in history in the US and in the world. What's going on out there? Anything happening? Anybody else nervous for the next week? Okay, we're not talking about it. Okay. We will pretend. We will pretend. Oh, there's an antitrust statement there. Okay. So I want to start by stepping back for a minute. I show this picture everywhere around the world where I speak, so it's not really, it's a trick question in many places. I say, where is this? In case you don't realize, this is LA. And the reason it's a little bit of a trick question is because we normally think and see LA with quite a bit of smog. You know, that's part of the location. But this was a day, this picture was taken, it was probably the cleanest air in LA history. And during that week, there were pictures going around the world, and I saw Sao Paulo and Beijing, Milan, New Delhi. Now, when do you think this was? Cleanest air ever. Yeah, this is the second week of April of 2020. Now, I'm not suggesting that the way to a clean world and sustainability is to shut down the global economy. But it gave us a vision, and I was really struck at that time that when we talk about sustainability, we get into the details pretty quickly, you know, carbon emissions and human rights and ESG and, you know, tick box exercises to answer questions, and we forget in a way why. And I just remind people now that when we get to net zero, when we are powering the world with renewables and driving EVs, this is what our cities will be like. We've taken for granted that it's unhealthy. This will be, I think, amazing. And then I try to imagine that the communities that are supporting these cities where 2/3 of humanity will be living, that those communities in mining and farming and all the things that support this industry, that those people will be paid living wages. They will have enough, that everyone will be sufficient. That's the world we're building, a thriving world. Now, I was told that a lot of the audience is in the weeds, in the companies, in the value chain and apparel, doing this hard work, and that it's good just to remind us that sustainability has a very strong business base. My first book came out 18 years ago, and we had this very simple 2x2 matrix of the ways companies create value, the work that we do every day. And fundamentally, there's things that reduce the downside, we cut costs, we reduce risk, and things that drive the upside. Innovation for revenue, for brand building, and intangible value. So I get the question, does sustainability pay? I mean, almost daily for 20 years. In almost every event I do, media interviews, it's the constant refrain, and it's come back pretty strongly in the last few years. And so I like to kind of just say, hey, yes, there's this basic idea of value creation over time. And I could give you examples of big companies, big brands that have created and measured billions of value in each of these buckets. Not everything under sustainability is all for, not everyone makes money immediately, but this is value creation. Reducing costs, reducing risk, or mismanaging risk, like VW did a number of years back with their cars. That was an environmental play, which turned into fraud, but that was environmental risk that they created for themselves. The companies that are selling more stuff because they're green or looking at their portfolios differently, and the intangible, the companies that, those up there just measured the value of employee retention and lower turnover and better engagement. So as we talked to prepare for this event, I talked to Claire and others, they had looked at something I'd written last year about the burden of proof on sustainability. When people call something a sustainability initiative, it gets asked questions that I think almost nothing else in business does. It's just assumed that it's a drag on earnings. And I'll kind of come back to this theme as I talk and point out all the different ways that this creates value. Now, this is one of my favorite pictures ever. I also point out that there are a number of things in business that became normal that were considered extra cost. Decades ago, safety was not a thing. 100 years ago, many of the same institutions or trade associations that are saying sustainability costs too much, reducing carbon costs too much, those same groups were arguing that taking away our ability to use child labor was too expensive. That was an argument. And we did it, right? We try not to do that anymore. We also added safety. Decades ago, we added quality. That became a thing where people got certificates. And at first, people said, it costs more. Why would I get to Six Sigma where I only have one error in a million? That sounds expensive. So we don't actually do the very cheapest thing. That's kind of a myth, right? We have things that we do in business because it just makes for a better product, a better business, and one we feel better about. Sustainability is that, but it hasn't quite jumped the shark in a good way to the safety and quality level. Now, obviously, we're in a fast-changing time. I think the pandemic caused a shift in many things, but sustainability was one of them. If you remember, early in the pandemic, Medtronic, a big medical device maker in the US, they released the design of a portable ventilator so the big auto companies could make them. And they did. I didn't know how you could convert a car manufacturing to a ventilator, but they did it. And I thought, well, this isn't maximizing short-term profit for Medtronic. It's the right thing to do, but I do know their employees noticed, their communities noticed. I do believe this helped them, even though it was just the right thing to do. But what happened during that time was that these kinds of actions, plus the murder of George Floyd and the concern about diversity and equity, it made the conversation, I think, bigger. And we got to this place where sustainability is about the role of business in society. And in a way, I think we felt we were all kind of winning in sustainability, and that caused somewhat of a backlash, which I'll come back to. But remember, there's no backlash unless you're doing well, unless you're winning. So the question businesses started to get, really, was, well, who are you? Who do you serve? Is it just shareholders? At the same time, there's been a kind of revolution in what people expect of business. Surveys, global surveys, the Edelman Trust Barometer every year, they discovered that business is not very trusted, kind of trusted, better than politics, which is a low bar, a little less than academics. But people around the world expect companies and CEOs to talk about these issues. And one of the things that I think created momentum in the last few years was the addition of the ESG language. And I have issues with it. It's not the same as sustainability, but it brought investors to the table. Larry Fink is the largest investor in the world. He has $10 trillion under management. And he started writing articles, kind of an open letter every year to the CEOs of the world. And he talked about, going back 6, 7, 8 years, he started talking about ESG and climate. He got hammered a year or two ago about saying ESG. And he stopped saying that word. But that company is still launching ESG funds and taking money in. So it hasn't actually changed much, but he apologized for using the word. But he has talked about this idea of stakeholder capitalism. This is the work I've done for 20 years, that this is how you create value. This isn't some additional thing from shareholder capitalism. It is about pleasing shareholders, so pleasing stakeholders. So this is a way that it pays to do this. You are able to speak to investors, and plenty of investors are still asking about this. Most are. We're in a time of, I think, exponential change. That's been true for probably over 100 years. And we are linear creatures. It is really hard for us to get a handle on what happens when things are moving exponentially. Our population, the amount of stuff we use, water, emissions, all growing exponentially. This is creating enormous problems. The core sustainability problems we have. One is inequality. There's racial and gender, but income kind of represents the whole thing. Most people don't realize that global wealth is divided very unequally. They don't realize it's this unequal. 1 out of 100 has 38% of the wealth. The next 9 have another 38%. That's the top 10% with 76% of the wealth. The next 40 have about a quarter, 20 to 25, and half the world shares 2% of the wealth. Now, capitalism has some great things. It's created the modern quality of life, but it has some flaws. And it's not just that there's some people that are richer and poorer, it's that over the last 40 years, in the developed world especially, this has gotten worse, much worse. And it means that people feel left behind. The middle feels left behind because they are. And that means, I know we're not supposed to talk about this, but that people are open to someone saying, I see you, you've been left behind, I can fix it for you. And this is happening all over the world. And it doesn't matter if that person doesn't care about the people they're talking to. Empty promises from politicians, but it works. People are feeling left behind. This is a destabilizing force. It's why companies need to help fix this problem. And of course we have climate. I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining this to you guys, but if we want to put it in financial terms, I mean, part of when I'm speaking to kind of sustainability professionals, people doing this work, my talk, I feel, is a little bit of a meta talk. This is showing how I've learned to talk about this for 20 years, and maybe give you some thoughts or ideas about how you go to your management, your peers, and I'll talk a little later about how you lead from the middle, and middle is a pretty wide range, up to, close to the C-suite. Now, Swiss Re, reinsurance companies know how expensive climate is. They've said that if we don't manage carbon well, over the next generation, we could lose 18 to 20% of GDP. Now that sounds bad, but livable. There's been Great Depressions, but I remind people that it's an average. Some places in the world will have higher GDP. Canada, Northern Russia. Most, though, will lose, and it's not just losing 18%, it's the places that lose 100%. Places that are too hot to live, that are literally underwater, the GDP falls to zero. And we don't really grapple with this. It's really hard to think about what's the return on investment when it's binary, when a place becomes uninhabitable. And then third, there's the biodiversity crisis. I just flew in yesterday from Colombia. I was down in Cali for the Biodiversity Summit very briefly. And look, people are very serious about this. This was the 16th, I think, year, but we're losing this fight. There was a big UN report last week about the pace of species extinction, and it's still rising. And Swiss Re again said, hey, let's just put it in financial terms. Over half of the global GDP is dependent on high-functioning biodiversity. I don't actually understand what the other 45% is. Like, I don't understand how anything isn't dependent on biodiversity. We are part of this species. Now, I think the pivot point that's critical is that, and I think starting years ago, the cost of doing nothing, all of these trillions I'm talking about, lost places in the world, is way higher than the cost of action. And you will still hear all the time, especially politicians say, we can't do climate change, we can't tackle carbon, it'll bankrupt us. It's ludicrous, because there's exponential change going on that's very good, including the cost of renewable energy. The clean economy has gotten radically cheaper. Solar and wind have come down 80, 90%. Now, in the last couple years, there's been kind of an uptick for the first time, really in everything, because supply chains, you know this. When you have a once-in-a-century pandemic, it screws things up. So everything got more expensive, but renewables are still cheaper. So again, you can almost say it with me, sustainability pays. This is why companies are doing this. This is why you see an exponential growth in corporate buying of renewable energy. I'm sure many of your companies are doing this. This is not utilities buying energy. This is 50 gigawatts a year of companies buying power. It's a lot. It's a pretty big number, and it's growing fast. And this, to me, just saw this story the other day, is amazing. The UK was 80% powered by coal as recently as 1990, and it just shut down its last coal plant. I didn't know this was coming. We are winning this. Like, the clean economy is coming. There's a lot of bad misinformation out there about hybrid and electric vehicles, which is, in some sense, because it's a backlash from the companies that are hurt by this growth, but this is exponential growth. There's been a slowing in the growth rate of EV and hybrid sales in the US, so because we tend to look inside, we think, oh, this is slowing. Not if you include China. The global numbers are growing really fast. China was at about 40% of their light vehicles mid-last year. 40% of new sales were EVs, which means today it's probably over half. Someone I was at the conference with said they were just in Beijing and it was like quiet. They noticed it. You could feel it. This is the beginnings of those really clean skies that we're going to get to. And the oil company in China said they think we're at peak oil demand. This is a big deal. And the support coming from countries and governments has been very big. The Inflation Reduction Act is the largest government action on climate ever, anywhere in the world. Hundreds of billions of dollars going out the door. And we've hit this tipping point again, starting a couple years ago, where there's more investment globally in the clean economy, at almost $2 trillion this year, than the fossil fuel economy, about $1 trillion. So this battle's actually over. But it's not like you're going to walk out the door and only see solar panels and electric vehicles. There's been an infrastructure of over 100 years that's going to take time to change out, in part because some of the products are just well made. I have a Toyota Highlander hybrid. It's 20 years old. It won't die. So I don't get the full EV yet. But this is happening. So this is the really good news. But let's not pretend that we're not still in a lot of trouble on these issues. But the pressure is rising on companies from a number of key stakeholders. I think the business-to-business pressure that goes through a value chain like yours is really critical. And there's lots of examples of companies saying, you need to do this, maybe we won't buy from you, we'll penalize you. But I like the stories where companies are finding ways to encourage better behavior. So the European retailer Tesco is working with Santander, the bank, and Santander's offering to Tesco suppliers, the ones who do well on carbon, ESG, they're getting lower cost of capital, better lending rates. That's just pure benefit. That's what we need more of. So it pays. Show your big customers that you're doing this right, tell the better story, and there's advantages. I've also seen data, and this is super debatable, we're going to talk about this in the panel, about is there consumer demand? It's always been a really hard thing to kind of make the case for in companies, because a percentage of people will say in surveys, a very high percentage say they will look for sustainability. But the percentage that really buy on it is usually single digits. That said, McKinsey had some data recently that showed that products with ESG claims were actually growing faster. So there was some movement here, finally. And in talking to the big companies, you could wonder, why has Walmart pushed sustainability for so many years? They have to believe there is pull from consumers. It isn't just, we think this is a nice thing to do. So again, it pays. Can you talk to consumers? But there's fundamentally two, if you remember nothing else, two giant kind of gigatrends that when I get asked, oh, there's a recession coming, which everyone keeps saying is coming, or there's anti-ESG, is this going to die out? I say, well, there's two things that are unstoppable. And one is transparency, led, thankfully, in large part by the EU, all of those reporting requirements that are overwhelming companies. This transparency is also connected to the clean label movement, which many of you probably know starts kind of in consumer products, things we eat, things we put on our bodies, where people want to know what's in it. They want to know what's the label, where did this thing get made, were the people paid a living wage, what's the carbon footprint, on and on. And there's transparency laws all over the world. Last year, one of my favorites that many of you have probably had to deal with is the German Supply Chain Accountability Act, which I show just because it's one word. I married into a German family, so this is my little poke at them of their language is hilarious to me. I don't know why this has to be one word, and I won't try to pronounce it. Someone German will come up to me afterwards and say, what do you mean it's I'm not going to really try. But we clearly know that there's a series of acronyms. This is a chart that the SASB folks put together a couple years ago. This is acronym time. It is overwhelming. I actually think there's clearly been a slowdown. What I've written about is kind of a recession in sustainability. I think this is driving that even more than the anti-ESG pressure, that it's just been overwhelming for sustainability people, and we haven't ramped up the number of people or the capital to make this a reality within organizations. That you have literally millions and millions of people who do financial accounting, and you have dozens who do non-financial accounting. And so there's a mismatch. And I see this everywhere. And the companies that are starting to get their sustainability people free from this are putting sustainability and ESG people in the CFO's office. I'm seeing really big brands doing that now. I met the IBM comptroller for ESG. That was not a job until recently, but that's good. This means sustainability people can get back to doing sustainability. But the transparency thing in this sector has always been really big. you've been ahead in many ways, but this was something that caught my eye at the beginning of the pandemic. You probably all remember this, but a workers' rights group just came out with a list of every brand and said what were they doing during the pandemic? Were they paying suppliers? And how were they handling this? It was very open. Now, the second big force besides transparency, and the one that really matters, I think, is just generational change. Again, the consumer data is always hard, but this was another study from EY saying Gen Z is going to flock to brands that share their values. Now, people will say, well, that's not true. As Gen Z gets more money, they're buying normally. You don't need a huge percentage of any group or any generation to shift for it to make a really big difference, right? Millennials are now starting to inherit huge amounts of money from boomers who are finally leaving. And I'm sorry, as a Gen X, I'm sorry to any boomers in the room. You may not be here anymore anyway, so we can make fun. But the generational norms, this is how change really happens in the world. Old ideas die out. I was kidding, but they die out because actually generations die out. New people come in. I have 2 Gen Z boys. They kind of painfully and viciously grew up on me and left. And my youngest one just went to college. And they know everything, if you've ever had a teenager. And my older one, the 21-year-old, says he doesn't believe anyone over 65 should vote, should be allowed to vote. He's not kidding. I told him to go talk to grandma and grandpa about that. But I kind of get where he's coming from. How does an 80-year-old feel about climate change? It can't be the same as a 25-year-old who's looking at maybe 80 years of dealing with this. The 2100, that's been the end of climate scenarios, every kid born into the Western world now, their expectancy is to live to 2100 or longer. If my kids live to the age of their oldest grandparent, it'll be the 2090s. And they're voting this fall. They're not even that young anymore. So there's plenty of evidence over years that millennials, I've been talking about young people and the pressure on business, and I've been talking about millennials. I've been doing this thing for many years. And I'm sorry to the millennials, you're not that young anymore. I can't call you the youngsters because you're hitting your 40s. And again, to my 18-year-old, mid-50s, mid-40s, same thing. So welcome to Gen X. And I love the Gen Z make fun of the millennials for being on Facebook and stuff. It's very funny. But the surveys have been very clear. As the younger generations don't feel this disconnect between profit and sustainability. They just think of companies as having more just general responsibility. And they come into the organizations with those attitudes. And clearly on social issues, they just have a very different view. So it pays. How are you going to attract and retain talent? These generations are now more than half the workforce and are becoming all of it. How are you going to attract and retain the talent? So what does this all mean? Well, we're in a time of a grand transition as we decarbonize the world, how we build buildings, how we get around, how we manufacture, how we do food, enormous shifts and all of the growing of things in that value chain, consumer products. These are multi-trillion-dollar markets that are in play with new kinds of products and services. And I think that these mega trends I've been talking about, the existential challenges themselves, the pressure from stakeholders, investors at the table, transparency and young people, these are the gigatrends. These are kind of hard to ignore. And that is different than the kind of political theater of anti-ESG. And I'm not saying it hasn't had an impact. It absolutely has. The US has embraced green hushing, as people call it, where companies just don't say anything. I will be honest, I think this has not been a time of courage for companies. Jeff Bezos, for example, not courageous. I think companies are backing down, afraid of people being angry. And I just, any client I have, anybody that will listen, I say, well, there's always angry people. Whenever there's a social change, there's angry people. We don't make our policies by them, right? And so I think it's having an impact, but I remind people that we weren't doing climate action because Greenpeace asked. We were doing it because there's climate change. And it's getting clear and worse. And we weren't doing diversity just because it seemed nice. It's because the world is getting more diverse. In the US, the under 25 crowd, white is now the minority, or the plurality. It's under 50%. The world is just more diverse. Now, without going into too much detail, I wrote this article about the anti-ESG movement and said there's kind of 4 buckets. You can find this online. I appreciate all the pictures, but but there's only the two groups that really matter. The one, when we talk about anti-ESG, we're talking about the kind of political people that I think are not operating in good faith. They're using it for political purpose, and they're kind of using it in a broad brush about just all sustainability, diversity, all sorts of things. But there's this other group of, like, I think generally authentic, they mean well, and it's kind of like the calls coming from inside the house. There's sustainability people that are really, really disappointed in progress, which I totally get, and they are calling greenwashing on companies, especially the banks that are using this ESG label. And I think this pressure is good, but I do feel like something's gotten a little out of hand lately, and the tenor of it's gotten pretty angry and nasty, which is what apparently all online discussion devolves into. And you have kind of a sense in some places now of everything that corporations have done is excuse the French, bullshit, right? It's all greenwashing, which is not true, right? I showed you like the chart of there's actual buying of renewable energy. There's actual discussions about materials. There's actually places that are working on regenerative agriculture. Is it enough? No. And I understand it comes from a place, I think, of panic about the world. I totally get that. But I think what we're seeing is the smart CEOs are saying, great, if there's this thing about ESG and it's toxic, I just won't say it. I'm still going to pursue my strategies, as the CEO of Coca-Cola said. It's good for the world, it's good for customers, clients, and I'm going to keep doing it. I'm just not going to call it ESG. Now, this urgency and the need to go faster is part of the reason I moved to work on a new book a few years ago called Net Positive that I wrote with Paul Pullman, who ran Unilever for many years. And he was, I think, always ranked as the #1 CEO. Unilever's facing some backlash as well, which I think is a little misplaced. I don't know why we attack the ones doing good work. It's a little weird. You know, it's partly the downside of being in the lead, is you kind of get hit. But we said, look, we got to go faster, especially the leaders. Incremental's not good enough, so we need net positive businesses, ones that profit from solving the world's problems, not creating them, that improve the well-being of everybody that they touch, intended or not. And the core question we ask is the world better off because your business is in it? I find that makes people pause a little. The principles of this kind of business, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it is longer term, it is multi-stakeholder, there is shareholder value, but it comes from doing the other things well. It's about partnership. Meetings like this are critical. And it's really about this ownership. And so to think about ownership extending a little broader than we normally do, we kind of took we're not the first people to do this, but we took kind of the scope 1, 2, 3 model and kind of expanded it. And most of you know, but scope 1, 2, and 3 on emissions is, on-site emissions, the electricity you're buying from the grid, and your value chain. And we said there's really bigger picture than that. There is, in addition to these 3, the sector. And when you talk about the sector, that's where you get to circular and regenerative models, and you get to something like your own Climate Plus. This is looking at the full picture. But there's also what I think of as level 5, and is what I've spent more and more of my time on in recent years, is the policy. What is your company advocating for? What are your trade associations advocating for? And then at the largest level, it's consumption, fossil fuel society. This chart, almost exactly like it, not for textiles, but in general, is in the book. The book's like $20. I see y'all taking pictures, but please, grab the book. I don't really make money on that, the publisher does, but I do want it out there. You can do this on the social side, right? Everybody in every sector talks about safety. Again, a new expense years ago. The well-being, and you get to these bigger views of the farmers and their lives and their well-being and the communities that they're in. Are we thinking about these issues? What's the policy framework? Are we pushing for regenerative agriculture and management of water and waste? And how are we handling poverty? Or, I don't know if clothing for all is a thing, I just made it up, but how are we housing and feeding and empowering people? Now, I'm not suggesting anybody in this room can solve poverty or consumption. This is about what problems can you help the world solve using systems thinking. And I won't claim that any company is at net positive. Of course not. The systems aren't in place. But there are some examples where you're seeing pieces of the story. IKEA now makes more energy on its stores than it needs. It is positive to the grid. But it's going beyond that and selling, because they also sell stuff, and that's good. They're selling solar to consumers. So they're going to be a multiplier of their own emissions. It pays. It pays to do this well. We also think there's a need for a different kind of leadership. And one of the leaders we admire is Ajay Banga. He ran MasterCard for many years, and now he's the head of the World Bank. And he used to talk about decency. In our book, we talk about caring. Kind of the first step in moving towards a net positive business is asking, how much do I care? And he talked about caring for the people around you. The aspects of this kind of leader that are, in addition to the kinds of normal things that good leaders have, are about courage, fundamentally. And as I said before, I think we're in a time of not very high courage. Courage is scary. It's about being inspiring, it's finding your own purpose and your own duty, and leading with empathy, humility, humanity, and being able to partner. I've also moved in the last couple years into kind of executive ed, more doing things online. Just, we need more people to be fluent in these things and have more leaders throughout organizations. So part of doing this is, how do you build the kind of inner core of this kind of business? Part of it is thinking about investments differently. I mentioned this at the very beginning, that when we talk about ROI and we're asked, is your sustainability initiative ROI positive, NPV positive? We're good at measuring how much cash something costs. And we're pretty good at saying we think this will involve some value. But we're really bad at measuring a bunch of other things. And I'm not talking about externalities here. This is internalized value to the business. What's the customer and employee loyalty advantage from this? What kind of resilience do we gain? These are hard things to put numbers on. As a friend of mine says, the only number we know it's not is 0. But we don't do it very well. And so we have to think about this as an investment, not a cost. And again, sustainability pays. And I know for a fact that companies do many things without an exact ROI, because I have the perfect proof right now. Most companies are spending a lot on AI. I just saw the editor-in-chief of Fortune magazine wrote something like, the question of whether the spending is worth it is the $600 billion elephant in the room. Companies are spending a lot, and I guarantee you they don't know the payback. Not every company is going to make money off bringing AI into their business in whatever level they're doing. Not everyone is going to do it well. But part of this inner core is thinking differently about the boundaries, understanding that what makes sustainability fundamentally different, even though I liken it to safety and quality, is that you're taking in the outside, the boundaries. You're thinking about basically the SDGs. What's the setup? What's the business plan for the world? And you need to set goals that are bigger than your own operations. Microsoft said they will capture carbon equal to all of their emissions ever. That's retroactive neutrality. Google says by 2030, they want to have only green electrons powering their business. That's tough. That means putting a lot on their roof. It means battery storage, but it also means partnering, changing the grids that they're a part of. The goals being set in kind of a net positive way, they're happening. More companies are getting there. Walmart, again, has kind of moved from just, let's get 1 billion tons out of our supply chain, to how do we be regenerative? Caring, as you know, how do we be net positive in biodiversity? Really hard questions. I think it's on the agenda, some of that today. What does it mean? It's tough. So I want to take a few minutes really quickly and point you to another resource. So Paul and I also wrote an article, I don't know, like a year and a half ago, about leading change. Being in middle management, again, middle can be pretty senior, running a factory. A middle manager in Walmart is someone running, say, a store, a $200 million business. So it can be senior, but they might not have the ultimate control. And this is hard work. What you're all doing is hard, and it's important. And I know this has not been the easiest year or two. It's become less fun, maybe, to be in sustainability. There were a couple great years. The investors come in, they want the CSO there. We're finally at the table, right? And then it's gotten hard, lots of questions. But I want to point out that there's kind of maturity level we have in this article. There's an obvious kind of maturity of businesses. I'll skip over level 1, which is the just purely skeptical. If you're in that business, come up to, we'll cry about it later, but come up and talk to me. But I think most companies, what's changed in recent years is most big companies are at the table. And so if you're at this place where most are, you're building a base, then your, I think, goal as a middle leader is to gather the data and get the systems in place, benchmark more widely than maybe you have, start to embed it, and find the sustainability stars in the organization, start to give them more power. You get to the place of leadership, the ones that are really accelerating, and there are still, even the ones that have gone quiet, there's still acceleration going on. It's how do you get speed and scale going? How do you get those non-sustainability leaders, which some are in the room, I'm sure, a procurement head, a marketing head, how do you give them the kind of power to get moving? And you start asking these bigger questions that get you to the partnerships that I'll close with in a couple minutes. And then finally, there's kind of the net positive level where you are addressing some really big issues, you're getting to things like policy, you're really trying to transform sectors, maybe the production of a particular kind of material, you're trying to transform this, and you get to real advocacy at the policy level. So the outer part of this, once you've got this core and you have this work going on inside, is about kind of value chain partnerships. It could be at the product level. I saw this product creation a few years back that I'm sure some of you know or you've used. I don't know the specifics of it, as an engineer or not, but this kind of low heat, low energy using way to make, filling, that's the wrong, insulation, that's the right word. And it's in, the usual suspects, Patagonia, Timberland. But this, I think, is interesting because this is a way to think about innovation, and this is actually what climate action looks like. It isn't just did we put solar on the roof, it's how did we make our products differently. This is not news to you guys. In this sector, in addition to obviously the textile exchange, I don't have to put up here, there's been some long-standing partnerships, right? Going back to data sharing years ago, to the newer ones where CEOs, at least on stage, are saying these great things. I don't know how much they've backed it up, but the Fashion Pact is CEOs out there saying, and this isn't all the companies, apologies to any brands I missed, but out there saying we got to set a net zero, net positive kind of goal for the sector. We're seeing, I think, the other good news besides the clean tech growth, the other good news that most people maybe don't see is that the really heavy industries in the world, the really intense materials like steel, aluminum, cement, shipping, flying, there's been increased partnerships to find ways to decarbonize. And they're working at it. And there's real, low carbon aluminum coming off the line that Apple's using, that Audi's using. You have, as far as I understand it, 40+% of the new steel plants are going to be using these electric arc furnaces, which is basically electricity. So you can plug in fundamentally to the same kind of grid and use renewables. And this group, the First Mover Coalition, is big companies saying we will buy the low carbon version. One of my clients is Trane that makes the heating and cooling systems for the world. And they had a really interesting thing, which is they were talking to their suppliers, and there were some offering low carbon steel. And so they went to the CEO and said, we want to buy some of this for our products, but of course it costs more. I mean, I never said sustainability never costs more. At any new technology, the scale isn't there yet. And he thought about it and he said, yes, because we'll sell more. And what he found was the really big buyers of renewable energy, mainly the big tech companies, they're coming to them and saying, we have to figure out how to decarbonize everything we're doing because our energy demand is growing so fast. Can you make the cooling systems? And by the way, cooling systems for a data center are like you can walk through the vents. They're enormous. Like data center will explode or burn down without a giant cooling system. The heat is intense. So this is a big part of their building. And they said, yes, we will pay more for that low carbon steel. So that is happening. It isn't like nobody's buying more sustainable products. So the fundamental question I ask is, what are the shared hurdles you have? I think that's what this meeting is partly about, because people do say to me, well, sustainability costs more, and I always ask, well, what costs more? Is it that the technology doesn't exist? Is it that there is a better material, but it costs more? How do we systematically bring that cost down? What's the scale we need? What are the policies we need? We got to work the problem. And this requires, I think, the easiest form of courage, which is collective courage. Going out to the market together, going out to your customers together, going to your suppliers together, going to the government together, and saying, let's figure out the right set of policies and industrial actions to make this work. The only real change comes with these full systems. One of the most intense carbon industries is making palm oil, which is in so many products. Indonesia is one of the biggest emitters of carbon just because they cut down forests to grow palm. And this has, been a problem, obviously, for decades. And the big buyers of palm oil were pushing for sustainable palm oil by just kind of saying, here's a label, do it. And that wasn't really working. And then they started to do more work at what they called the district level. They got local farmers, municipalities, the government. They brought the big buyers together. They brought in the NGOs. They brought in Greenpeace and WWF, who had better practices. They said, we can help you double yields. We know some better species. But then they needed money. So the Sovereign Fund of Norway, Unilever, and others put money in to help these farmers transition. And deforestation rates have actually been falling. It's been a success. This is the kind of partnership, and it's hard, that gets us to a place where we have healthy nature, the healthy animals, and the healthy people living off that nature. In the end, the purpose of all my work, really, is that we cannot thrive. And I mean that in whatever term you want. In business, we can't profit unless people and planet are thriving. So I ask you to think about, for the rest of this event, and when you go home, how will you be net positive? And the way we all answer that is going to save the world. Thank you very much.